A police officer was on his evening patrol with his loyal K9 Rex when a thick column of black smoke rose at the end of a quiet suburban street. Rushing toward the blaze, he heard desperate shouts. There was still a puppy inside. But when they broke through the flames, what he found made his heart pound for reasons far beyond the fire. The tiny German shepherd, trembling in a locked room, barked furiously at one man in the crowd, a man the officer would soon discover had every reason to silence that bark forever. What happened next will make you cry and believe in the power of loyalty and justice. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels, and if you believe every animal deserves a loving home, not fear and loneliness, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change the way you see the world. The late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent over Riverside, a mid-sized American town where life tended to move at an easy pace. The town sat tucked between two low ridges, their wooded slopes glowing in shades of gold and amber as autumn crept in. It was the kind of place where the streets had names like Maplewood and Oak Lane, where neighbors still waved to each other across driveways, and where the biggest excitement most days was the arrival of the mail. But that day, the air had a different weight to it, a heat that clung stubbornly, left over from summer, mixed with a restless breeze that whispered through the trees. The pavement still held the warmth of the midday sun, but the edges of the shadows were cool, almost cold. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower droned, its steady hum blending with the rhythmic chirp of crickets hidden in the grass. Officer Mark Dawson sat behind the wheel of his black-and-white Ford Police Interceptor SUV, guiding it down a quiet stretch of Maplewood Drive. 38 years old, Mark carried himself with the quiet assurance of someone who'd seen enough to know when to act and when to simply watch. His brown hair was cropped short for practicality, and there was a dusting of silver at the temples earned, not aged. He had broad shoulders and a posture that was both relaxed and alert, the kind of stance that said he could spring into action in an instant. His eyes were the real giveaway. Calm, but always moving, taking in the position of a parked car, the faint twitch of a curtain, the way a street's noise shifted from one block to the next. Those eyes had a weight to them, a quiet empathy mixed with the habit of reading a situation before anyone else noticed there was one. In the passenger seat sat Rex, his canine partner and, in many ways, his closest friend. Rex was a German shepherd with a sable and black coat that rippled with muscle beneath it, the kind of strength built from constant training rather than idle growth. His ears stood tall and forward, every sound a possible signal. His amber eyes carried an intensity that could make a suspect freeze, but softened whenever Mark's hand found the top of his head. They had been partners for nearly 3 years, long enough that they could communicate with a glance, a shift in breath, or the faintest gesture. In that time, Rex had saved Mark from more than one dangerous encounter, and Mark had carried Rex out of situations where the dog had given everything he had. The bond between them was more than handler, and K9 it was two halves of a single working unit. Today's patrol was meant to be uneventful, at least on the surface. But, for weeks, Mark had been quietly threading together the details of an investigation's small gaps in inventory records, unexplained shortages, and whispered concerns from employees at a local construction supply company. The company was managed by Steve Moore, a man in his early 40s with the kind of charm that played well in public. Steve was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair always slicked back, his beard neatly trimmed. He shook hands firmly, remembered names, and could talk about baseball scores or town council meetings with equal ease. But Mark had learned over the years that charm was sometimes a mask, and there was something about Steve's easy smiles that felt measured, too controlled. For now, Steve was only a name in Mark's notes, but it was one that kept resurfacing in ways that were hard to ignore. Mark turned onto the next block, letting the SUV roll at a steady 25. The houses here were a mix of modest ranch-style homes and slightly newer single-story builds, their lawns dotted with the last stubborn blooms of late summer. Rex sat upright, eyes scanning through the windshield, his nose twitching as the air currents shifted through the open vents. That was when it happened. Rex's head snapped toward the far end of the street. His nostrils flared wide and a low growl began deep in his chest. Mark didn't question it. He followed the dog's gaze, and there it was, a thick, dark column of smoke rising into the fading light, curling upward like ink spilling into water. It stood out starkly against the soft blue and gold sky, wrong in its density, wrong in its color. His foot pressed harder on the gas. The SUV's engine responded with a deeper hum as they closed the distance. As they drew closer, the smell hit them first, the unmistakable tang of burning wood, then something sharper, chemical, riding the back of the heat. Mark's instincts told him it wasn't from cooking or a fireplace. Fires fed by accelerants had a different bite to their scent, a dangerous edge. Rex barked once, a short, urgent sound that broke the quiet hum of the SUV. Mark rounded the corner, and the scene came into full view. A one-story house stood near the intersection, its beige siding scorched in places, the garage door already warping inward from heat. The air shimmered with waves of rising temperature, and the yard was scattered with figures' neighbors in various states of alarm, some clutching garden hoses that sprayed weak arcs of water toward windows already choked with flame. The roar of the fire was constant now, a deep, greedy sound punctuated by the occasional sharp crack of something giving way inside. The smoke billowed thick and black from the roof, rolling across the street and making the air taste bitter. Mark eased the SUV to the curb and threw it into park. The moment the engine cut off, the sounds of the fire rushed in flames, shouting, and something else beneath it. Rex jumped down the moment the passenger door opened, landing lightly despite his size, his eyes scanning the crowd. Mark stepped out after him, the late afternoon heat replaced instantly by the oppressive wall of warmth from the burning house. Through the haze, movement caught Mark's eye, a petite, older woman standing near the curb, her hands clutched to the front of her cardigan as if to keep it closed against the heat. It was Carol Summers, one of the neighborhood's longest residents. In her late 60s, Carol had a stooped frame and fine white hair tied back in a loose bun. She had a face that was quick to smile under normal circumstances, the kind that made children feel safe and neighbors feel welcome. But now, her pale blue eyes were wide and frantic, darting from the house to Mark as he approached. Mark had known Carol in passing. She was the type to offer him lemonade in the summer when he drove by on patrol, to stop and chat about the state of the park benches or the stray cats near her garden. She'd been widowed for over a decade, and maybe because of that she had developed a fierce protectiveness toward the living things around her. As Mark and Rex closed the gap, the fire's heat pressed harder, and the smoke clawed at the back of his throat. He could see the flames now, curling inside the shattered front window, painting the ceiling with a flickering orange glow. Carol's voice broke through the din, high and trembling but loud enough to carry. "There's still a puppy inside!" Mark didn't waste a second. The flames were growing with every breath of wind, the heat curling up from the doorway like an invisible wall. He glanced at Carol Summers, who still stood near the curb, trembling with her hands clasped against her cardigan. Her pale blue eyes were wet now, her voice shaking when she shouted over the roar of the fire. "It's the shepherd pup from Linda's place. That poor thing barks its head off every time Steve comes around. I told her—" She broke off, coughing as the smoke swept toward her. The words hit Mark like a flicker of a match, quick and sharp. Every time Steve came around. That was a detail he filed away instantly. He turned to Rex, who stood rigid at the base of the porch steps, ears pricked, nose lifted toward the smoke, body tense like a coiled spring. "Let's go, partner," Mark said. They moved up the steps together, Mark using his shoulder to shove against the front door. It didn't budge. The paint had bubbled and peeled, clinging to the swollen wood beneath. Rex growled low, pacing at the edge of the porch, then returned to the door, pawing at it in short, impatient bursts. Mark dropped to one knee, pulling the Halligan bar from his belt clip. He jammed the flat end between the frame and the door, muscles tightening as he leveraged the steel tool. The door groaned, but held. Smoke curled out from the cracks like a warning. A sharp crack sounded from somewhere inside, part of the ceiling giving way. Time was bleeding out fast. He shifted the bar, slammed the forked end against the jamb, and forced the door inward. The hinges screamed, then gave way in a sudden lurch. The wave of heat that hit him was blinding. His skin prickled instantly, sweat starting before he even crossed the threshold. The air inside was heavy, thick, every breath dragging smoke deep into his lungs. "Stay close, Rex," he barked, crouching low as he moved inside. Rex slipped ahead, belly low, weaving between toppled furniture. The German shepherd's tail was straight out, his movement purposeful. He didn't hesitate at the branching hallway, didn't sniff at random corners. He went straight for the right-hand door, pawing at it urgently. Mark followed, boots crunching on glass and charred fragments. The smoke made every step a battle to keep his bearings. The door was locked. Mark didn't pause. One kick and the frame splintered. The door swung inward, releasing a dense cloud of smoke that wrapped around him like a shroud. There, in the far corner, was the source of the barking he'd heard outside. A German shepherd puppy, no more than 4 months old, caged in a wire crate. Its fur was soot-streaked, the black saddle of its back dull under the haze. Its eyes were red from the smoke, but they burned with a fierce, almost stubborn defiance. The pup barked in rapid bursts, ears pinned back, paws scraping against the bars. "Easy, buddy," Mark said, his voice low and steady despite the pounding in his chest. Rex was already there, teeth catching the edge of a thin, soot-marked blanket draped over the crate. He pulled it aside, freeing the latch area so Mark could reach it. The puppy barked once more, then yelped when Mark's gloved hands closed around its small, trembling frame. Its body was lighter than he expected, ribs faintly visible beneath the thick coat. It pressed its head against his chest, still trembling, but its eyes darted toward the doorway, as if searching for someone or watching for danger. "We've got you," Mark murmured. From somewhere outside, Carol's voice rang faintly, still speaking to someone. He caught snippets between the roar of the flames. "That dog never liked him. Barked every time. Linda said—" The rest was swallowed by the crack and pop of fire tearing through the ceiling beams. A loud crash in the hallway snapped his focus back. Burning debris had fallen across part of the exit. "Move, Rex," Mark commanded. Rex darted ahead, nose to the ground, finding the narrowest path through the fallen wood. He stopped once, glancing back to make sure Mark was following. The heat was worse now, the air tighter. Mark ducked low, the puppy tucked safely under his arm, Rex's tail just ahead like a guide rope through the smoke. They burst through the front doorway and into the open air, the sudden rush of cooler oxygen hitting Mark like water. Carol was there, eyes wide, one hand flying to her mouth when she saw the pup. "Oh, thank God," she breathed. The puppy gave a sharp bark, twisting in Mark's arms to look toward the street. Its little body stiffened, a low growl rumbling in its chest. Mark followed its gaze and saw Steve Moore standing halfway down the sidewalk, his arms folded, expression tight. Mark adjusted his grip on the trembling puppy as they stepped further from the burning house. The animal's heartbeat pounded against his forearm, its sharp little claws digging into his jacket. Rex stayed close to his side, tail stiff. His gaze locked on the same point the puppy was fixated on. The closer Mark got to the edge of the crowd, the more the scent in his nostrils shifted from acrid smoke to something sharper, metallic in its pungency. Gasoline. Not the faint whiff you'd expect from a lawnmower left too close to a wall. This was stronger, more deliberate. It clung to his senses, cutting through the heavy air like a warning. The locked bedroom door came back to mind. He had felt the brittle wood crumble under his boot, had seen the lock scorched but intact enough to know it hadn't been broken from the inside. Someone had trapped that dog in there, and someone had used fuel to make sure the fire took hold. From the corner of his eye, movement pulled his focus. Steve Moore stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, his broad frame blocking the flicker of firelight behind him. Up close, Steve's build was more imposing, tall, heavy in the shoulders, the kind of man who had once worked with his hands and still carried the strength of it. His dark hair, slicked back with precision, showed no sign of the heat or sweat affecting the others nearby. The beard along his square jaw was trimmed close, almost military neat. "Hell of a fire," Steve said, his tone pitched just loud enough for those nearby to hear. His blue eyes skimmed the puppy in Mark's arms but never lingered, sliding away as if the animal didn't matter. "You got it out in time. Good work." The puppy's reaction was immediate, its ears flattened, lips peeling back over small white teeth. A snarl, low but sharp, rose from its throat, each bark like a dart aimed directly at Steve. Mark noted the way Steve's jaw tightened just slightly, the faint twitch in the corner of his mouth before he turned his gaze elsewhere. Carol Summers moved closer, the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead catching the firelight. Her cardigan was still clutched around her shoulders like a shield. "Mark," she said, voice still unsteady from the heat and smoke, "you remember Linda's husband, David, before he passed? He told me once he had something papers, maybe that could get Steve here in trouble. He was worried, but he wouldn't say more. Then—" She let the unfinished sentence hang heavy in the air. Mark caught her meaning without her needing to finish. David had died unexpectedly, leaving Linda a widow. The thought of hidden evidence, combined with the smell of gasoline and a locked room, began stitching itself into a picture he didn't like. Rex stepped forward, planting himself between Mark and Steve. The shepherd's hackles were up, the deep rumble in his chest echoing the smaller dog's sharper barks. His amber eyes never left Steve, tracking even the smallest shift in his posture. Steve raised both hands slightly, palms out with a forced half-smile. "Easy there, boy. I'm just here to see if anyone needs help." His voice carried the smoothness of a man used to talking his way through tense moments, but there was a brittleness underneath, like he was holding his breath. Mark didn't answer right away. He glanced down at the puppy, whose body was still taut as a bowstring, then at Rex, whose stance had only grown more rigid. Dogs didn't fake this kind of reaction. The crowd murmured as the fire crew worked, their shouts blending with the hiss of water against flame. Somewhere behind them, a ladder clanged against the roof. Carol gave Steve a tight-lipped look before stepping back, muttering under her breath. Mark couldn't catch all the words, but the tone was clear distrust. He shifted the puppy into his other arm, letting his free hand rest on Rex's collar. The shepherd's muscles vibrated under his palm, every sense locked on Steve. Mark decided to keep his words minimal. "We'll talk later." Steve gave a short nod, eyes flicking to the firefighters as if they were suddenly more interesting, then stepped back into the shadows at the far end of the street. The puppy barked one last time, a sharp sound that seemed to follow him, and then buried its face against Mark's chest. Rex finally let his tail ease down, but his gaze stayed fixed in the same direction until Steve was gone from sight. The flashing lights from the fire trucks had begun to fade as the crews got the flames under control, leaving behind the acrid stench of wet ash and scorched wood. Neighbors had started to drift away, murmuring in low tones, though a few lingered on the sidewalk, unwilling to turn their backs on what was left of the little beige house. Mark stood off to the side, holding the puppy in the crook of his arm. The dog had calmed slightly, but every so often its body tensed as though it remembered the room, the heat, and the smell of gasoline. Rex sat at his side, posture relaxed enough to fool a stranger, but his eyes stayed restless, watching. That's when a voice, low and shaken, called out from behind the crowd. "Mark?" He turned and saw Linda Hayes moving toward him. She was in her early 30s with a slim build that made her seem taller than she was. Her long chestnut hair was tied back loosely, and strands had escaped to stick to her cheeks, damp with tears and sweat. Her brown eyes were wide with a kind of stunned disbelief that didn't belong entirely to the fire. It was the look of someone returning home to find her world shifted without her consent. Linda was wearing navy blue scrubs, her name badge clipped to the collar, the kind you'd expect from someone coming straight off a shift at the hospital. Her work shoes were dusty and worn, and she still had a stethoscope looped around her neck, an afterthought in her hurry to get here. She reached Mark and froze, her gaze moving past him to what remained of her front porch. "My God!" Her voice was almost a whisper. Is everything gone?" Mark shook his head slightly. The structure's still standing, but it's going to need serious work. You weren't home? She shook her head, still staring at the house. Evening shift. Her eyes dropped to the puppy in Mark's arms, and she gasped. Buddy? The puppy's ears perked at the sound of her voice, and it let out a soft whine before licking the air in her direction. Linda's hand shot up to her mouth, relief flooding her expression. I thought... She blinked back tears and reached to stroke the dog's soot-streaked head. Mark nodded toward the garage, now blackened and collapsed on one side. Linda, I need to ask you something. Did anyone else have access to your property? Keys to the garage, maybe? Her answer came too quickly to be rehearsed. Steve. He offered to check in after David died, said he wanted to make sure nothing was left to fall apart, especially the garage. I didn't think much of it. He and David used to be on friendly terms before... Her words faltered. Before things got... tense. Mark didn't press yet, but the weight of her statement settled in his mind like another stone in the pile. A voice from behind them cleared his throat. Mark turned to see Alan Peters, a wiry man in his late 50s, stepping forward. He wore faded jeans and a red flannel shirt with sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. His weathered face was framed by silver hair and a trimmed beard, and he had the habit of looking you straight in the eye when he spoke, an old neighborly courtesy. Officer, Alan said, holding up a small black USB drive between two fingers, you might want to see this. My porch cam picks up the street. It caught something this afternoon before the fire. Mark took the drive, raising an eyebrow. Mind if I view it now? Alan shook his head. Already backed up the footage at home. This is a copy. Didn't want it getting lost in the shuffle. They moved toward Mark's SUV, Linda following closely. Curiosity and dread competing in her expression. Mark slid into the driver's seat, plugging the USB into the laptop mounted to the center console. Alan leaned against the doorframe while Linda stood just behind Mark's shoulder, Buddy in her arms now. Rex sat by the rear wheel, watching the quiet street. The footage flickered to life, grainy but clear enough to see movement across the street from Alan's porch. A timestamp in the corner read 3:14 p.m. A man appeared in the frame, walking along the sidewalk toward Linda's house. He carried a red plastic gasoline can in one hand. Even through the static quality, the slicked-back dark hair and heavy-shouldered frame were unmistakable. Steve Moore. Mark zoomed in slightly. Steve glanced around once, then disappeared into the side yard. The footage ran for another minute before he reemerged, empty-handed, striding back the way he came. Linda's lips parted in shock. I know, Mark said quietly. Beside the SUV, Rex gave a single sharp bark. His gaze was locked on the screen, as if the static image of Steve on the monitor had drawn the same reaction the man himself had earlier. Buddy, perched in Linda's arms, gave a small growl in perfect unison with Rex's bark. Mark didn't look away from the footage. The reaction of both dogs was as telling as the video itself. Alan, Mark said, glancing up. I'll need to keep this for evidence. The older man nodded once. It's yours. Just make sure something gets done about it. Mark closed the laptop and slid the USB into his jacket pocket. The chain of evidence was growing stronger by the hour, and the picture it painted was one he couldn't ignore. By the time Mark left the scene of the fire, the sun had dipped low enough to turn the streets of Riverside into a wash of amber light. The smell of burnt wood still clung to his clothes, and the faint scent of gasoline lingered in his nose like a warning that refused to fade. Buddy was in the back seat of the SUV, curled in a blanket Mark had grabbed from the station. The puppy's breathing had settled, but every so often, when a car passed too close, he'd lift his head, ears twitching, alert as if expecting trouble. Rex lay stretched out beside the crate, his amber eyes occasionally flicking toward Buddy. It wasn't just protective instinct. Mark had seen Rex behave like this before, when he recognized a witness or a victim was still in danger. Mark's mind was already working over the next steps when his phone buzzed against the dashboard mount. The caller ID read Hayes. Tom Hayes had been a police officer in Riverside for nearly 30 years before retiring last spring. In his late 50s, with a tall, wiry frame and hair gone almost completely white, Hayes carried himself like a man who had never truly taken off the badge. He had a habit of standing with his hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning the room in that quiet, methodical way detectives had. Mark answered. "Hayes?" "I heard about the fire," Hayes said without preamble, his voice a low rasp that hinted at years of cigarette smoke. "Thought you might want to see something I've been sitting on." Mark frowned. "How about you meet me at the diner in 20? Make it 15. Bring your appetite." The Blue Lantern Diner sat at the corner of Main and Oak, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the darkening sky. Inside, the smell of fried food and brewed coffee hung in the air. Hayes was already in a booth near the back, a manila folder resting on the table beside his untouched mug. He looked up as Mark slid into the seat across from him. "Evening," Hayes said, sliding the folder across. "I got this from a friend over in county finance before I retired. Didn't have a case to hang it on, so I kept it in my desk. When I heard Steve Moore's name attached to that fire," he tapped the folder, "it all came back." Mark opened it, flipping through neat stacks of photocopied documents, bank statements, invoices, transfer logs. The numbers jumped out. Large sums moved out of the company's accounts without clear documentation and always in chunks small enough to avoid triggering automatic scrutiny. "How much?" Mark asked without looking up. "North of 200,000 over the last year," Hayes replied. "Your widow, Linda, her husband had copies of some of these. He came to me once, wanted advice, said he thought Steve was up to something dirty. I told him to bring me proof. He never did." Hayes's gaze darkened. "Then a few weeks later, he's dead." Mark leaned back, processing. The pieces were aligning the missing funds, the fact that David Hayes had kept evidence, and the sudden hostility Buddy showed toward Steve. "Buddy barked every time Steve came around," Mark said quietly. "Carol confirmed it tonight. That dog's instincts are telling us something." Hayes nodded. "Dogs know, sometimes better than people." After leaving the diner, Mark didn't head straight to the station. Instead, he drove past more construction, Steve's company. The lot was empty except for Steve's black pickup, parked at an angle near the back fence. The fading light caught on something under the truck bed. Dark, viscous streaks against the gravel. Mark parked a block away and approached on foot with Rex trotting beside him, his paws silent on the pavement. "Easy," Mark murmured, unclipping Rex's lead. The shepherd circled the truck once, nose working. He stopped abruptly at the tailgate, head dipping low. His tail stiffened and he gave a low, short bark. Mark crouched and saw the smear of oil fresh still glistening and beside it, faint droplets of something darker. Gasoline. Rex sniffed again, then moved toward the driver's side door, nose brushing the seam near the handle. He gave a sharp huff, almost like confirmation. Mark straightened, a slow burn settling in his chest. This was circumstantial enough to hint, but not enough to convict. Still, every small piece mattered, and Rex had just given him another. He gave the shepherd a firm pat between the ears. "Good work, partner." Driving back to the station, Mark glanced in the rearview mirror. Buddy was asleep now, head resting against the side of the crate. Rex lay beside him, the steady rise and fall of his chest matching the rhythm of the road. Mark knew what the file in his passenger seat meant. Steve had motive, the embezzled money. He had a reason to silence anyone who might have evidence, and David Hayes had been that person. Buddy had been a witness of sorts, barking every time Steve tried to get close, and now the house was gone. The line between motive and action was narrowing, and Mark was ready to close it. The call came just after 10. Mark was still at his desk, the file from Hayes spread open in front of him, when the phone on the corner of his desk buzzed with a priority dispatch tone. "Unit 12, the dispatcher's voice crackled over the line. "Be advised, Steve Moore's black pickup just left his residence at high speed. Possible flight. Last seen heading west on Riverside Highway." Mark didn't hesitate. He scooped up his jacket and keys, whistling for Rex, who was dozing on his mat in the corner. The shepherd rose instantly, stretching once before trotting to Mark's side, ears forward, eyes bright. The night air was cool and sharp as they stepped out of the station, the streets washed in the orange glow of sodium lamps. Mark could feel the hum of tension in his chest, the kind that came before a chase. Rex leapt into the passenger seat of the SUV, and within seconds they were tearing down Main Street, the engine growling in the empty night. Traffic was sparse at this hour, just the occasional sedan cruising home from a late shift or a lone cyclist pedaling under the dim glow of the streetlights. The police radio kept feeding details, a partial plate sighting here, a glimpse of taillights there. Steve was moving fast, taking side streets to avoid the main drag. Mark's phone buzzed on the dash. The caller ID flashed an unfamiliar number, but he hit speaker anyway. The voice that came through was low, hurried, and tense. "Steve, you don't know what you're doing, Dawson. You think you've got something? You don't, and if you keep pushing, you're going to regret it." Mark didn't answer. Instead, he kept his focus on the road, watching the GPS tracker that another unit had managed to ping from Steve's last known location. Over the line, there was a faint rustling, then a different voice gravelly, older. "Bring the files. We'll burn them tonight." The call cut off. Mark's jaw tightened. Files. That meant Steve wasn't just running, he was meeting someone to destroy evidence. They caught sight of him near the outskirts of town, the black pickup a dark shape against the pale shimmer of moonlight on asphalt. He was pushing well over the speed limit, the tailgate bouncing slightly on its hinges. Mark flipped on the lights but kept the siren off. In a chase like this, noise was as much a warning as a tool, and he needed Steve to believe he wasn't right on top of him. The pickup swerved suddenly, turning down a narrow county road that cut through a stretch of farmland. The two-lane blacktop was rough and pitted. The yellow center line faded almost to nothing. Rex shifted in his seat, head swinging toward the right. His ears pricked sharply, and he gave a low, insistent bark. Mark glanced in the direction Rex was pointing there. Almost hidden by a line of overgrown hedges was a dirt road branching off from the main. If Steve knew the area, he'd take it. It was a shortcut to the old wooden bridge over Mill Creek, a perfect place to meet someone without being seen. Mark eased off the gas for a heartbeat, letting the SUV roll past the turn, then braked hard and swung in. The tires kicked up dust and gravel as they hit the dirt track. The road twisted through the darkness, the beam of the headlights cutting narrow tunnels of visibility. The smell of damp earth mixed with the sharp tang of creosote from the bridge timbers ahead. Mark killed the headlights as they approached, coasting the last 50 yards. The wooden bridge stretched over the creek, its planks worn and weathered from decades of use. Beyond it, the faint glow of another vehicle's taillights lit the gloom. Steve's truck. It was parked just before the bridge, the driver's door hanging open. Steve stood beside it, a thick manila envelope in his hands, speaking to a second man shorter, broad through the chest, wearing a dark hoodie pulled up over his head. From this distance, Mark couldn't make out the words, but the body language was tense. Steve kept glancing over his shoulder, and the man in the hoodie had his hands shoved deep into the front pocket, a habit Mark had learned usually meant a weapon or contraband. Rex gave a soft, almost inaudible whine, the sound vibrating with anticipation. Mark leaned closer. "Easy, partner." "Not yet." He radioed their position, requesting backup to block the far side of the bridge. The reply came back with static backup was 10 minutes out. Too long. He made the decision in an instant. Pushing the door open silently, he signaled Rex to follow. They moved low along the side of the road, using the shadow of the creek bank for cover. The crunch of Steve's boots on gravel carried clearly now, along with snatches of conversation. "These go. No one can touch us," Steve was saying. The man in the hoodie nodded. "Then let's get it done." That was enough. Mark broke from cover. "Police! Drop it!" Steve spun, the envelope still in his grip, eyes going wide. The man in the hoodie cursed and bolted for the bridge. Rex was already moving, muscles bunching as he sprinted forward. He cut across the gravel, angling toward the runner. With a single leap, he was on him, teeth clamping onto the man's sleeve and dragging him down hard. Steve froze, caught between the instinct to run and the knowledge he was outmatched. Mark closed the distance in 3 strides, wrenching the envelope from his hands and snapping cuffs over his wrists. The whole scene had taken less than 30 seconds. By the time backup arrived, Steve was in the back of the cruiser, scowling into the darkness. The man in the hoodie sat on the ground nearby, nursing a bruised arm and muttering under his breath. Mark gave Rex a firm scratch behind the ears. "Nice work," he said. The shepherd's tail gave a single wag before he settled back beside his handler, eyes still locked on Steve as though daring him to try again. 2 weeks after the midnight arrest at Mill Creek Bridge, the Riverside County Courthouse was packed. The air inside the main chamber carried a hum of quiet conversations, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional creak of wooden benches as townspeople shifted to get a better view. The trial of Steve Moore had become the talk of the community, partly because of the fire, partly because of the whispered rumors about money, but mostly because everyone wanted to know if the law would truly hold him accountable. Mark sat near the front, in uniform, with Rex at his side. The German shepherd lay stretched along the polished tile floor, his head resting on his front paws, but his eyes roamed the room with quiet alertness. Beside Mark, a small crate held Buddy, the rescued puppy who was now clean, well-fed, and considerably more relaxed than the night of the fire. Linda sat 2 rows back. She wore a simple navy dress and a thin gray cardigan, her hair pulled neatly into a bun. The strain of the past month was etched into her features, but her posture was steady. The fact that Buddy was alive and that Steve had been caught was the only thing that kept her from collapsing under the weight of what had happened. At the judge's bench, Judge Eleanor Briggs presided with a steady gaze. In her early 60s, with close-cropped silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, she was known for her no-nonsense manner and an intolerance for theatrics in her courtroom. The prosecution began with the video evidence. The grainy porch cam footage played on a large screen set up for the jury. Gasps rippled through the spectators as the image of Steve walking toward Linda's house with a red gasoline can filled the screen. The timestamp was there for all to see, hours before the fire had started. Next came the financial records photocopies of invoices and bank statements laid out on the projector. Hayes was called to the stand, his calm, measured voice walking the jury through each irregularity, explaining how the missing funds linked directly to accounts Steve controlled. Then came the witness testimony. Carol Summers was sworn in, her voice steady despite the attention. She described hearing Buddy barking furiously whenever Steve came around, and how on the night of the fire she'd realized the barking had stopped only after the smoke started pouring from the house. Linda testified next, explaining how Steve had retained a key to her garage after David's death and how she'd trusted him at first, until she learned from Carol and others that Buddy never seemed comfortable around him. The most damning detail came when the fire investigator presented his report. The bedroom door where Buddy had been found showed burn damage consistent with being locked from the outside, trapping the animal inside. Gasoline residue had been detected in multiple locations, including near the garage and hallway. Steve's defense attorney, Glenn Porter, a short, round man in his 50s with thinning blonde hair and a fondness for expensive suits, tried to paint the evidence as circumstantial, but his arguments slid off the solid wall of facts the prosecution had built. When Steve was called to testify, he avoided Mark's gaze entirely. His voice was smooth, but his hands clenched the railing of the witness stand, the tendons standing out like cables. It took the jury less than 4 hours to return with a verdict: guilty on all charges, arson, destruction of evidence, and animal cruelty. After the sentencing 15 years without parole, the courthouse slowly emptied. Outside, the cold bite of late autumn air wrapped around Mark as he walked with Linda toward the parking lot. Buddy, now out of his crate, trotted between them, his leash clipped to Mark's hand. Linda stopped, looking down at the pup. I don't have anywhere safe for him right now," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Would you keep him, at least until I can get settled?" Mark nodded without hesitation. "He'll be in good hands." The weeks that followed saw Buddy's life transform. Mark set up a corner in his home for the pup a warm bed, a box of toys, and, most importantly, Rex's constant company. At first, Buddy stuck close to Mark, wary of strangers and flinching at sudden noises. But Rex, patient and deliberate, drew him out. They started with short walks together, then simple obedience drills in the backyard. Rex would demonstrate, Buddy would watch, and soon the pup was mimicking the older dog's moves. Within a month, Buddy was following basic commands, chasing after training dummies, and even starting short scent exercises. Mark noticed the change not just in Buddy, but in Rex. The older shepherd seemed more animated, more engaged, as if having a younger partner to mentor had rekindled a spark in him. One evening, Mark leaned against the porch railing, watching the two dogs wrestle in the yard, their barks sharp against the quiet of the neighborhood. He couldn't help but smile. What had started as a rescue had turned into something much bigger, a partnership, and perhaps the beginning of Buddy's own future in service. For now, they were simply two dogs, playing under the pale winter sky, while their handler kept watch. Winter in Riverside had a way of softening the town's edges. The trees stood bare but proud, their skeletal branches etched against a pale morning sky. Frost clung to the tips of fences and rooftops, glittering in the early sunlight. Mark leaned against the railing of his porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. In the yard below, Rex lay sprawled in the grass, his sable and black coat catching the light like polished bronze. Beside him, Buddy bigger now, his frame starting to fill out with muscle sat upright, ears flicking toward every sound. It had been 6 weeks since the trial. The nights of paperwork, interviews, and follow-up reports were behind them. Steve Moore was locked away, and the town had slowly shifted back into its usual rhythm. Mark had heard from Linda once or twice in that time-short phone calls about Buddy's progress, each ending with a promise that she'd come by soon. He knew she'd been busy finding a new place to live, something smaller and safer. That morning, a dark blue sedan pulled up in front of the house. Linda stepped out, bundled in a long charcoal coat, her breath puffing in white clouds. Her hair was loose today, catching in the breeze, and the tiredness he'd seen in her eyes during the trial was gone, replaced with a softer light. She smiled as she walked up the path. "Morning, Mark." "Morning," he replied, setting his mug on the porch railing. "Guessing you're here to see someone?" As if on cue, Buddy caught sight of her. His ears shot forward, and with a burst of speed he bolted across the yard. Rex was right behind him, his longer strides easily keeping pace. Both dogs barked in excitement, a sound that cut through the quiet street and made a couple of curtains twitch in the neighboring houses. Linda knelt just in time for Buddy to crash into her arms, tail whipping like a metronome set to double time. Rex circled them once, letting out a deep, joyful bark before leaning in for his share of the greeting. "You've gotten bigger," Linda said, holding Buddy's face between her hands. She kissed the top of his head, her voice dropping to a murmur. "And you look happy." Mark watched from a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. He didn't need to step in. The moment belonged to them. Linda straightened, brushing away a bit of frost from her coat. "I found a place," she said. "Small, but it's mine. I wanted to see him before I start moving in, to know for sure he's okay." "He's more than okay," Mark replied. Rex made sure of that. At the mention of his name, Rex trotted over, standing tall beside Buddy. The contrast between them was striking. Rex, the seasoned K9 with a calm, measured gaze, and Buddy, the younger dog whose energy seemed to spill from every muscle. But they moved together naturally, like partners who had worked out an unspoken rhythm. Linda glanced at Mark, her expression softening. "I never really got to say it properly, thank you, for saving him. Buddy was David's dog. He meant the world to him, and now, after everything, knowing he's alive—" Her voice faltered, but she smiled through it. "It's like having a piece of David still here." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in the cold morning air. "We just did what needed doing. Rex here was the real hero that night." Linda crouched, resting one hand on each dog. "Then I guess I owe you both." They spent the next half hour in the yard. Linda tossed a ball for Buddy, who bounded after it with reckless enthusiasm, while Rex hung back at first, then joined in with a controlled sprint. It wasn't long before the two were wrestling in the frost, rolling and tumbling in a blur of fur and paws. Mark leaned against the porch railing again, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Watching them like this, he realized something he hadn't been able to put into words before. The case was over, but what they'd fought for, life, loyalty, connection, was still moving forward in the simple joy of two dogs at play. The world didn't stop having its shadows, but here, in this yard, in this morning light, it felt like they'd carved out a little piece of peace. Rex looked up from the wrestling match just long enough to meet Mark's eyes. It was the same steady gaze he'd given in the burning house, on the bridge that night, in every moment that counted. It said, without a sound, "We're still here." "We did it." Mark gave a slow nod in return. "Yeah, partner," he murmured. "We did." Sometimes miracles are not about parting seas or moving mountains. They come quietly, in the form of a loyal dog who refuses to give up, a stranger who chooses to step in, or the strength to keep going when the fire around you says to stop. I believe God places these moments and these people in our path for a reason. Just like he sent Rex to lead Mark into that burning house, he sends us into each other's lives at exactly the right time, to protect, to comfort, and to remind us we are never alone. In everyday life, it might be as simple as listening when someone needs to talk, offering help before it's asked for, or standing up for what's right even when it's hard. And when we act with that kind of love and courage, we become the miracle someone else has been praying for. If this story touched your heart, share it so others can be inspired too. Comment below where you are watching from, and if you believe God still works through loyal hearts and everyday heroes, type Amen in the comments. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, protection, and the courage to follow the path He has placed before you. And if you want more stories that lift your spirit, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.
"Get that mutt out of here before I call animal control." The woman's voice cracked through the cold morning air like a whip. The old sheepdog flinched but didn't run. His fur, matted with mud and streaked with burrs, puffed slightly in the breeze as he stood motionless near the steps of the bakery. Don't one stepped forward. The townspeople of Greyford had grown accustomed to ignoring strange things. This wasn't a place that welcomed disturbances, not the kind that made people stop and feel. After all, hadn't they buried enough memories already? But the dog wasn't begging, he wasn't barking, he wasn't even moving much, just stood there with a photograph between his teeth edges curled, the ink smudged in one corner, a child's face, smiling, windblown hair, a missing tooth, a crooked little parting. The photo had the feel of something once loved, now passed from too many hands. Inside the bakery, Owen Lowell watched the scene unfold. His hands were deep in flour, but his eyes were locked on the dog. His face was weathered by years of early mornings and a long-ago war no one asked him about anymore. He didn't say anything until the woman stormed off in a huff, muttering curses about strays and diseases. "You see that?" he finally said, to no one in particular, except maybe to Liv, the teenage girl sweeping near the back. She glanced up. The dog, Eminem, been out there 3 days. Same photo, same spot. Live set the broom aside. "Why's it carrying a picture?" Owen's voice lowered. "That's the question, ain't it?" The dog turned then, not toward them but toward the post office across the street, as if it was waiting for someone, or maybe remembering something. His gait was slow as he padded over, limping slightly, and lay down by the flagpole. No one in Greyford had time for ghosts, not the living kind, and certainly not the ones that looked like dogs with sad eyes and unanswered questions. But hadn't always been like this. 10 years ago, a fire had torn through the southern woods. A small cabin had been lost. A family too, or so they thought. The town had mourned, briefly, and then they'd moved on. That's how it worked here. Grief was supposed to be quiet, buried under schedules and grocery lists, but then came the dog. Miriam Ellery was the first to make the connection. She was 82 and no longer trusted her eyes, but she trusted her memories, especially the bad ones. She saw the photo as the dog lay outside the library where she volunteered. He had curled up on the cool concrete, placing the image in front of his paws like an offering. Miriam stared, her knees buckled slightly. "I know that child," she whispered, her voice thin with disbelief. "My God, that's little Emery." Harlan. The name hit her chest like a falling stone, but that wasn't possible. Emery had perished in the fire, or at least, that's what the sheriff's office had declared. The bodies had never been recovered, the blaze too hot, too fast, just pieces of the home, and ashes. The boy had only been 6. So how could his photo still be out there? Why was a dog no one recognized from anywhere in town carrying it around? And why had it come back? Miriam's hand trembled as she reached for her phone, then stopped. Who would believe her? Grayford had chosen forgetfulness. They had turned mourning into silence. But the past somehow had teeth and paws. The sheriff, Declan Ward, received Miriam's message later that night. He listened to her voicemail twice before deleting it. He'd known Emery, knew his parents, knew the case, or at least he thought he had. But the very next morning, the dog returned to his office. Steps, same photo, same eyes, and this time there was a second photograph beneath the first. This one wasn't of a child, it was of a woman. One Declan had buried with the rest of his past, and suddenly, the silence in Grayford wasn't the comforting kind anymore. It was the kind before something breaks. Sheriff Declan Ward stood still, his breath fogging against the cold glass of the front door as he stared down at the two photographs resting beside the dog's worn paws. The first was the same Emery Harlan, wild-haired and grinning. The second was a ghost from his own life, the face of a woman he hadn't seen in 13 years, and not because she had moved away. She was supposed to be dead. Her name was June Ratlin, a name he hadn't spoken out loud since the night she disappeared into the same woods that had taken Emery's family. She was a quiet woman, thoughtful, with a stillness about her that had made people uneasy. She wasn't from Grayford. She'd wandered in some time after the war, before the fire, and worked odd jobs for quiet people. But she'd been kind, especially to Emery. Declan had seen it himself. The way her face softened whenever the boy toddled up to her at the general store or sat next to her on the porch of the town's only church. And then one day, she vanished, just like Emery. The fire came not long after he bent down slowly, ignoring the strain in his knees, and reached for the photographs. The dog growled low, warning, not threatening. Its eyes, cloudy with age, locked with his. It didn't bare its teeth, just pressed a paw down firmly on the images, as if to say, not yet. You don't get to run from this again. Declan sat down right there on the step, exhaling through clenched teeth. His mind was racing. Someone was playing a game, dragging, upgrades, but who and why now? The town was beginning to murmur. Word about the dog had spread past the bakery and library, past Miriam Ellery's hushed theories, and into the hands of the internet. A teenager had filmed the dog lying beside the war memorial, paw pressed against the photos like a vigil, and posted it to a small social media page. Somehow within 48 hours it went viral. People from outside Grayford were beginning to show up, asking questions the locals hadn't dared voice for a decade. The past had become spectacle. Inside the station, Declan placed the photographs in an evidence bag, even though he knew there wasn't a crime. At least, not one anyone had admitted to. But something about the woman's face haunted him. There had been rumors after her disappearance, whispers about how she'd known things she shouldn't, that she used to walk the woods barefoot at night, that she talked to herself, that she listened to the forest. He'd dismissed them back then, tired of the town's tendency to create monsters out of misfits, but now he wasn't so sure. That evening, as dusk spilled across the empty sidewalks, Declan went to visit Miriam. She was waiting for him on her porch, wrapped in a quilt, eyes sharp despite the years. She didn't ask why he came. She simply lifted her hand and pointed to the end of her driveway. The dog had returned. This time he wasn't carrying anything, just sitting, waiting. He's not random, she said quietly. He's trying to show us something, or lead us into madness. Declan muttered. She looked at him, tired and unblinking. He came back with that photo of June for a reason. You and I both know no one else had that picture. Declan swallowed hard. That was the part gnawing at him. The photo had been taken by him years ago. June had laughed as she leaned against a sunlit fence outside the old mill. He'd never printed it, never shared it. It had been on an old hard drive in his attic. As far as he knew, it had never left his possession. So how did the dog have it? That night, sleep refused him. Memories churned like a slow storm. Emery's parents sobbing in the sheriff's office. The skeletal remains of the cabin. The unanswered question of why no bodies were ever found. Declan had let the story settle because the town needed it too. But now, the dog was pulling it all back into light. Just after midnight, the dog began to bark. It was the first sound anyone had heard from him in days. Declan stepped outside and followed the sound down the road. Others joined Miriam in her robe, Liv wrapped in a hoodie, Owen from the bakery holding a flashlight. The dog didn't stop. He trotted toward the southern woods, the ones that had burned all those years ago, and without hesitation, slipped between the trees. No one said a word. They followed. The forest had long since grown over the scars of fire, but something in the air still felt broken. The soil held a strange stillness, as if time had stopped beneath it. After nearly 20 minutes of silent walking, the dog stopped. He scratched the ground, whined once, then backed away. They stared down. It wasn't a grave, not exactly, just a soft sunken dip in the earth, covered in moss and rotted leaves. Declan dropped to his knees and began to dig, hands clawing through the damp. The others watched, unmoving. 2 feet down, his fingers struck metal, a tin box. Sealed and rusted but intact. He pried it open. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, were more photographs, all of them of Emery. Some with his mother, others with June, and then something else, a birth certificate issued 1 year after the fire. The name read, Emery Rallen. Declan's blood turned to ice. It wasn't the fire that had hidden the truth, it was the town, and someone had tried to erase a child's second chance. The dog, quiet now, lay down beside the open box, rested his head on his paws, and closed his eyes. Whatever he had carried this far, he had finally delivered. Declan didn't speak for a long time. The birth certificate trembled in his hand, its edges curling from moisture and time. The name struck him again, Emery Rallen, and behind it, a quiet truth none of them had dared imagine. The boy hadn't died in the fire. He'd lived under a new name, under the care of a woman everyone had forgotten, or chosen to forget. June had taken him, not kidnapped, from what Declan couldn't yet say, but it was clear now she'd faked his death, started over, and kept him hidden from the town that failed him the first time. Miriam slowly lowered herself onto a nearby log, her face pale and eyes locked on the open tin. All this time, she murmured, she was trying to protect him. Owen nodded faintly, arms crossed tight over his chest. But from who? And why lie about the fire? Declan didn't answer. The woods around them were suddenly too loud. Rustle of leaves, the distant creak of old pines swaying, even the dog's breath beside the box. He glanced at the dog, now silent, his cloudy eyes watching them all with a weight that felt almost human. The animal had guarded this truth like it was sacred. And now that the secret had surfaced, Declan felt something worse than confusion. He felt guilt. He stood and paced slowly, gripping the certificate tighter. We failed her, all of us. June must have known something she couldn't say out loud, and when no one listened, she disappeared instead. But how did Emery end up back out there, alone? Liv asked quietly, stepping beside the sheriff. Her voice was uncertain, too young to carry a weight this heavy. If she saved him, why did he end up lost again? Declan shook his head. I don't know, not yet. They walked back in silence, the tin box wrapped carefully in an old flannel Owen had brought from his truck. The dog stayed close, padding alongside them as if he'd been part of this town longer than any of them. His limp was more pronounced now, and for the first time Declan noticed the deep scar trailing down his right side, not fresh, years old, like the dog had survived something no animal should have survived. Back in town they gathered in the old community hall, the only place with enough space and enough heat to think. Declan spread the contents of the tin across the table, photos, letters, the certificate, and leaned over them with tired eyes. There were drawings too, childish sketches, done in bright crayons, some with stars, others with stick figures holding hands, and one, tucked beneath them all, that made Declan sit down hard. It showed a house steenie, box-shaped flames drawn in red pencil licking at the roof. Next to it, two figures, one adult with long black hair, and a child. Above them, in shaky letters, the word safe. This wasn't just a fire, Declan said slowly, lifting the page. This was a cover. Someone tried to erase them. Owen frowned. But who'd do that? Everyone in town knew the Harlans. They were normal. Miriam's voice cut in, low and raw, maybe too normal. Everyone turned. She looked up from the photographs, hands folded in her lap. I saw things back then, things I never told anyone. Emery's father, Paul, he was strict, controlling. The boy flinched every time he raised his voice. June, she used to wait outside their house at night, like she was making sure someone got through it alive. We all saw it, in pieces. But no one said anything because Paul paid his taxes, waved at the postman, coached Little League. That made him safe, didn't it? Her words filled the room like dust kicked off old bones. Declan knew she was right. Grayford had never been cruel, just passive. But passivity bred something worse than malice, forgetfulness, and now, the cost of that silence had come back in a photo clenched in a dog's teeth. A soft knock at the door interrupted the silence. Live moved to open it. A boy stood outside, maybe 15, thin clothes torn in the knees, eyes wide like he'd spent weeks watching shadows, and in his hands, wrapped in a stained blue blanket, was a journal. He didn't speak at first, just held the book out toward Declan like it was. Burning his fingers, I followed the dog, he said finally. He found me 3 days ago. I didn't know what to do. He kept bringing me this. He made me look. Declan reached forward and opened the journal. Inside were drawings, not just scribbles, pages of detailed sketches, each one showing fragments of life hidden deep in the woods. An old trailer, a fire pit, 2 sleeping bags. The last pages shifted tone, a woman's face, gaunt and tired, the boy, the dog, and finally, a date written, in red ink. October 14th, the last day. That's when she died, the boy whispered. June, she'd been sick for weeks, didn't want help. Just told me to stay hidden, said someone might still be looking for me. I didn't understand, not then. Miriam gasped softly. Emery. He looked up for a second. No one breathed. My name's Emery Rallen, he said. But I used to be Emery Harlan, I think. I think they were going to hurt us. She kept saying we had to stay invisible. Declan's hands trembled as he closed the book, and the dog, still lying by the threshold, let out a long, weary sigh and rested his head on his paws. He had finished his journey. But for Grayford, the reckoning was only beginning. The silence in the hall after Emery spoke wasn't peaceful. It was the brittle, breathless kind, the kind that settled in just before something fractures. Declan leaned back, staring not at the boy, but at the floor beneath his boots, as if answers might crawl out of the cracks if he waited long enough. Emery sat across from him, hunched and thin, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. He didn't look like a ghost from the past. He looked like a child who had survived something too big to name. No one had prepared for this. Not Miriam, whose eyes brimmed with tears she couldn't wipe away fast enough. Not Owen, who kept glancing at the door as if someone else might walk in, someone who could make sense of all this. Not Liv, who hadn't sat down at all, just stood at the far end of the room near the windows, watching the dog as it slept. Emery cleared his throat softly. She was scared all the time near the end, even when there was no one around. She told me not to speak to anyone, not even if I got hurt, just to run. And if anything ever happened to her, the dog would know what to do. Declan's brow furrowed. How long were you alone after she died? Almost 3 weeks. We had some canned food. I thought maybe she'd wake up, but she didn't. Then I left. The dog found me again a few days later. The boy's voice cracked at the edges, but he didn't cry. Not even when he said her name. That frightened Declan more than anything else. Children were supposed to cry. They were supposed to ask questions. Emery had none. He had learned to survive without expecting rescue, and now, somehow, that survival had led him right back to the town that failed him. Miriam reached forward and gently touched the boy's hand. You don't have to go back there, she said softly. Not tonight. You can stay with me. Just for a while. Emery hesitated, then nodded once, but Declan wasn't listening. His eyes were still on the dog. The animal hadn't moved in hours except to shift slightly, as if guarding an invisible border between the world of the living and something much older. There was something about him that unsettled Declan, not fear, but awe. This wasn't just a pet. This dog had been chosen. He rose from his chair and walked over slowly, kneeling beside the dog. Who sent you? He whispered under his breath, feeling foolish as he said it. But the dog opened one eye. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't nothing either. It was acknowledgement. That night, Declan drove out to the old woods alone. He needed answers, and the only place they might still live was where everything had once burned. He parked beside the trailhead that had long been overgrown, pulled on his flashlight, and followed the same path the dog had led them through just days earlier. The woods were silent again, but not empty. It felt as if he were being watched, not by eyes but by memory itself. He found the clearing easily, now marked by disturbed soil and the faint prints of their shoes. He knelt beside the place where the tin box had been buried and dug again. Not for more items, but for the ground itself. He wanted to understand why June had picked this spot, why this hollow, hidden patch of earth had been sacred enough to entrust with the last truth beneath the dirt. Wrapped in a plastic tarp, he found something else. Another envelope. Inside were handwritten pages, folded carefully and bound with twine. The ink had faded in places, but the words were unmistakable. It was a letter. From June. Declan unfolded it slowly, heart pounding. To whoever finds this, if anyone ever does. My name is June Rallen, and I have kept a child hidden from his own father. He read on, eyes scanning the hurried, desperate scroll. Paul Harlan is not what he seems. He abused his wife, and he hurt Emery, not with fists, with silence, with fear, with threats. He told the boy monsters would come if he ever told anyone. I knew because I had grown up with a man like him. I tried to go through the proper channels, but no one listened. Everyone thought Paul was a good man. They only see what they want to. And then ... the fire. Declan's hands clenched the letter tighter. I didn't set it, but I saw someone leave the woods that night. Someone from town. I know what they did. They helped him cover it. Or maybe they were just too afraid to stop it. I ran with Emery. I changed his name. I raised him quiet and far. I let the town believe we were gone, because if they believed that, maybe no one would come looking. The last line was jagged, as if she'd written it in a rush. If you're reading this, I'm probably dead. But the boy isn't. He deserves to live in truth. Please, don't let him disappear again. Declan didn't sleep that night. He returned to town at dawn, face gaunt, hands still dusty with earth. The weight of the letter was heavier than the box had ever been. The next morning he stood before the town council, a group that had once prided itself on efficiency and order. He laid the letter on the table and looked each of them in the eye. No more silence, he said. We buried truth to make life easier. That ends now. But some faces turned away. Some already whispered that it wasn't their fault, that it had been a long time ago, that they hadn't known. Only one person stepped forward. Miriam. She took the letter, pressed it to her chest, and turned to Emery, who stood near the door with the dog beside him. You were never lost, she said. We just refused to see. And for the first time, the boy looked less like a shadow and more like someone who might finally be coming home. The days that followed moved differently, slower, quieter, as if Greyford itself had exhaled after holding its breath for a decade. But peace didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. in glances exchanged across aisles at the grocery store, in the wait behind every apology, no matter how softly spoken, in the way people began pausing, really pausing, when they saw Emery walking by. He didn't speak much at first. No one expected him to. He moved like someone who had spent too long hiding in the trees, unsure if light meant safety or danger. Miriam took him in, just like she'd promised. Her home became something more than a shelter. It became a tether, a place to start piecing together a life that had never been allowed to grow roots. She kept his meals warm, never forced conversation, and left the porch light on long after he went to bed. For the first time, Emery had a room with a door he could close without fear. The dog stayed too. At first, he never left Emery's side, following him from room to room with the calm attentiveness of something ancient. Declan stopped by nearly every day, not as a sheriff, but as a man unlearning the way he'd once ignored warning signs and convinced himself silence was justice. He brought small things: a flashlight, a compass, a new sketchbook. Once, he just brought a photo of Emery's mother, one Declan had found in an old station file, and left it on the kitchen table without a word. And Emery, little by little, began to draw again. He drew the woods, but not the ones he had run from. He drew new trees, with golden light between them. He drew houses with open windows and dogs with gentle eyes. He never spoke about the fire, or the trailer, or those 3 weeks spent alone beside his mother's body. But he drew them, and Miriam knew better than to ask for more then. One morning the dog was gone, no tracks, no sound, just his empty spot by the foot of Emery's bed and a quiet stillness that settled over the room like mist. Miriam searched the porch. Declan drove the perimeter. Liv checked the bakery alley where he used to curl up near the smell of bread, but no one found him. It was as if, having completed his task, he had simply vanished. Emery didn't cry. He walked into the woods that evening, alone, and sat in the clearing where the box had been buried. He stayed there until dark. When he came back, he didn't say what he'd seen. He only asked Miriam if they could leave out a bowl of water by the back step, just in case. Time passed. There were reporters, of course. A few weeks after the story reached a national network, cameras rolled into town. Declan refused interviews, so did Miriam. Emery was never approached directly. Everyone knew better by then, but he still felt their presence, hovering on sidewalks like ghosts with microphones. Eventually, they moved on. There wasn't enough footage, no clean ending, just an old town, a quiet boy, and the trace of a dog who'd known more than anyone had dared to ask. And Grayford began to change. A plaque was mounted near the library, not far from where the dog had first appeared with that weathered photograph. It bore no grand title, no names, just a line etched in brass: "Truth waits for those who listen." Flowers were placed there every now and then, a chew toy, a faded copy of the birth certificate, laminated and tucked beneath a smooth stone. One day, months later, Miriam opened her mailbox to find a package wrapped in brown paper. No return address. Inside was a collar, old leather, worn through the edges, a tag still attached, though barely legible. She held it up to the light and made out a single word: Bram. She showed it to Emery later that night. He didn't say much, only held it quietly, in his hands. Then he turned and hung it on the edge of his headboard that night. For the first time, he slept without the porch light on. By the end of the year, Grayford's mayor issued a formal statement acknowledging the town's failure to act when it mattered most. A scholarship was created in Emery's name, not because he asked for one, but because someone had to make it clear his life wasn't a tragedy. It was a truth reclaimed. Emery didn't stay in Grayford forever, but he stayed long enough to grow stronger, long enough to believe that he could someday live without fear. When he left, it wasn't with fanfare, just a quiet goodbye and a promise to keep drawing. He left the bowl by the back step. Miriam never moved it. Years later, someone hiking through the southern woods found a stone carved crudely with 2 initials, JR, beneath it. Tucked in a hollow of tree roots was a small stack of drawings wrapped in plastic. They were dry, untouched by rot. One showed a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile. Another a boy holding a leash. The final one was different. It showed a field of wild grass, sunlight beaming through the clouds, and at its center a dog alone, still watching, still guarding, not waiting anymore, just home.